Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. This week we're going to be talking about contemporary realistic fiction. But before we get started, I just want to remind you that spring break is next week from the 12th, the week of the 12th. So I won't be posting anything new next Tuesday, Wednesday. So you'll have 2 weeks to do, it's going to be a 2 week week. You'll have 2 weeks to do everything that you usually do in 1 week. Everything is listed out in Blackboard. I just wanted to remind you at this point. So how do we define realistic fiction? Zeifer and Tyson calls it imaginative writing that accurately reflects life as it was lived in the past or could be lived today. So you can see that realistic fiction covers a broad swath of time, but we're going to divide it into historical and contemporary, and we're going to look at historical realistic fiction, which we're just going to call historical fiction, in another lecture, and we're going to focus on contemporary. It's hard to define contemporary versus historical. There's no real strict dividing line. People often say go back 50 years. This can be good for adults, maybe too long for children, because realistically, if you look at what most students who are in schools today were not even born when 9/11 happened. I mean, that was will be 17 years ago in September. So they certainly were not aware, even if they had been born, they weren't aware of what was going on in the world. So it's the past to them. So certainly you could be a little more, you could have a shorter time period when you're talking about children when it comes to historical fiction. If you're using, like everything that we do, like everything that we talk about, nothing is set in stone in terms of categories when it comes to books. So if you have students looking for historical fiction, or if you're assigning historical fiction for a assignment, you want to probably be a little bit more specific what you consider historical for them, and which will depend on what you want them to get out of it. If you want them obviously to read about a specific time period, then that makes it easier. But if you just want them to read historical fiction, if you're doing reader's advisory as a librarian, you just determine what they're interested in and go from there. If it's for an assignment, work with the librarian, or work with the teacher to kind of get the right books into the hands of your children. Some books are really kind of timeless. Some realistic fiction, you have to look at the clues, technological clues, or perhaps even clothing, or some aspect of the environment, because there's a timeless kind of concern about them, and you really might not know when it takes place without really investigating. But the other thing I wanted to mention about realistic fiction is something that C.S. Lewis said, that it features the kind of thing that could possibly happen, and that can be either things that typically happen to people, going to school, going to work. These are things that happen every day, taking the train, whatever. Things that might happen once in a while, vacation, or a trip of a lifetime, or meeting somebody famous, or may have happened once or could possibly happen, winning the lottery, or something very unusual with a lot of coincidences that you wouldn't expect to happen, but within a realistic setting and without the intervention of magic, or possibly some kind of technological advance, which would put it into the realm of science fiction or fantasy or magic realism, could possibly happen. Contemporary realistic fiction can really help readers gain an understanding of and empathy for others in a way that other types of other genres of books can't. I think the more you read, the better, the more empathy you have and the more understanding you have. But in particular with realistic fiction, you're actually trying on things that you might never experience in real life. So you're actually stepping into people's shoes who are facing things that could actually happen, which has a little different impact, I think, on you perhaps than if you're stepping into the shoes of somebody who's facing a dragon. There can be realistic elements in that in the way that they respond, and you learn from that, but it's something different than if you're stepping into the shoes of somebody whose parents are going through a divorce. So it gives you a different kind of perspective that other types of reading might not. It helps you see different perspectives and experience things that you might not be familiar with. Like if you grow up on a farm, you can read about somebody who's actually going through their daily life in the city, and it would be something new to you, and vice versa. The other thing about realistic fiction, it's often the most popular type of fiction, and it not my favorite, but many adult readers and children and YA really like realistic fiction. So what I'm going to do is go through, as I have in the past in other lectures in this class, is kind of group some books together to introduce you to these books under topics. And this one includes books which have animals in them. And a book that was from the perspective of an animal, I would not consider realistic fiction, because we're making up what's going on in the mind of that animal. There's not a way to know. As far as we know, there's not a way to know. But these are books that feature animals in them. So I really like Gordon Korman. This one is called No More Dead Dogs, and Wallace Wallace refuses to write a favorable book report about Old Shep, which in this book is standing in for I think Old Yeller, and in Old Shep the dog dies, and he's not going to write any more papers about books where dogs die. And I can totally empathize with that feeling, because I don't like to read about dogs dying in books myself. So all kinds of adventures into it. Wallace Wallace is perfectly capable and smart enough to do this. He just decides he's not going to. So I think he's made to help out because his English teacher also, I think, is with the play, so he's made to help out with the play, and all kinds of things happen. But it's very funny. Kate DiCamillo writes wonderful stuff, and she writes both realistic fiction and things like the mouse one, and gosh, it went right out of my head. But she writes fantasy and she writes realistic fiction, and this is realistic. And Winn-Dixie is actually the dog, Opal's new dog, who's named after a store. So Winn-Dixie is part of her life and coping with the changes in her life. I really like Henry and Mudge. This is an easy reader. No More Dead Dogs is probably like 6, 7, 8. Winn-Dixie maybe 5, 6, 7. I don't really remember, but it's not, I don't think, up to YA. Henry and Mudge is definitely an easy reader, kind of that third level of easy reader as it's getting a little bit more difficult. I think I mentioned Mr. Putter and Tabby. It's sort of on the same level as that. And I always liked these books because our first dog was a fawn Mastiff like Mudge is. We now have Brindle Mastiffs, but I always like to recommend these books to kids because I could tell them I have a dog that looks just like this, or I did at that point. Humor is also very popular in realistic fiction. Angus Thongs and Full Frontal Snogging is a YA book that was really popular. There's a series that were very popular, and it's British, so I think kids get a kick out of reading, teens get a kick out of reading it. Snogging is kissing, so they got to learn, as Harry Potter is very popular, so is other series about teens from from the UK. Ungifted is another Corman book. Again, I want to say middle grade, maybe a little younger, and he's Donovan Curtis is very impulsive and just doesn't think before he acts, and to the extreme in this case. And it gets him into trouble, but it also gets him into the gifted school through it. And this is where there's a series of events that are very unlikely, but not influenced by anything other than coincidence and happenstance. So he gets into the gifted school, although he's not classically gifted. He winds up bringing the robot team together through his own special talents that he has. Just being who he is, he manages to contribute and bring together the robot team. So it's very funny and very interesting. Also interesting here, talking about, he really notices, I think this is the book where he really notices the difference between what the gifted kids have in their school, because it's a separate school, and what he didn't have in his school, which I thought was very interesting. Dave Barry, I had to read this book just because I used to love his columns. He's a humor columnist, and this one is a class trip gone hysterically wrong. It's a lot of things that could possibly happen, although are very unlikely to happen, but under certain weird sets of circumstances, they could happen. Mysteries are one of the subsets of realistic fiction that I actually really enjoy, and that it's again things that kind of push credulity. If you think about Murder, She Wrote and Jessica Fletcher and all of the people that died wherever she went, or Miss Marple, if you're a British mystery fan, and she's in this little British town, and there's a never-ending murders happening around her. But they're very fun, and it could happen. Probably wouldn't, but it could happen. It's not anything that's happening in these that is caused, again, by something that's outside the realm of what we expect to happen in real life. So, of course, Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys are classics that are still found in libraries. They're doing them in graphic novels now and have been around. They actually were harder to find in libraries at one point because libraries didn't like to have series in them, and as we all know, the best mysteries are in series because you get to know your detective and you get familiar with how they operate, and it just becomes very comforting to read mysteries in a series. So we have Cam Jansen for the youngest. She's a 5th grade female detective with a photographic memory. Encyclopedia Brown, who's 10 years old and solves mysteries. These have been published since 1963. Sammy Keys is an amateur detective who lives illegally with her grandmother in a senior high-rise when her mother runs off to be a movie star. Again, all things that could happen, might probably wouldn't, but it's not outside the bounds of reality. And the final one I have here is a book by Carol Plum Ucci, who is a New Jersey author, and I believe this takes place, I'm hiding the grades, it's grade 7 and up. It's definitely a teen novel, and as you can see, it got the Prince Award. 16-year-old Tori Adams tries to solve the mystery of the disappearance of a bullied classmate in this one. Sports, there's not enough sports fiction, I don't think. I think that there is a bigger appetite for it than there actually is. Matt Christopher's been writing sports books for a long time, one of the few before Lupica came along. These books actually, both Matt Christopher and Lupica, who was a sports columnist and a sports commentator, write very sports-centric books. Christopher, I read like one from a long time ago that I had around the house, and it still holds up because the focus is on the sport, which hasn't changed that much. And it's one of those where unless you pay attention to the technology and what's not there, unless, having a cell phone if he had a, if it gets to a point in the plot where if he had a cell phone, then something would be easier, then you notice it, but other than that, you might not notice it. So those are good for younger. Lupica's grades 3 to 7 also, which is an awful wide grade range, but I think they might do that because there's not enough of these. And Chris Crutcher does definitely YA. He tends to focus more on issues, male problem novels, kind of with sports as a backdrop. All the younger stories, as I mentioned, were sports as more of the main issue there. Dairy Queen is a YA novel that I really like because it features a young woman as the main character. 15-year-old DJ Schwenk helps her father on her dairy farm in Wisconsin over the summer and practices and wants to try out for the football team, the high school football team in the fall. So it's kind of a different twist, and it was kind of a fun read. School, family, and friendship are all things that realistic fiction tends to focus on. The Landry News, Andrew Clements does a lot of these types of books, particularly within schools. In this one, fifth grader Kara Landry publishes her own newspaper in a school with interesting results about nonconformity and popularity. Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, this is a YA novel that was popular and made into a movie. I guess you could say these are four best friends, if you haven't heard of this, four best friends who find a pair of jeans, buy a pair of jeans that look good on all of them. So there's a little bit of stretching and maybe a little bit of magical realism there, because that's almost an impossibility that on four different types of shapes that the same pair of jeans would be flattering, but we'll go with it. But it follows the four go have different things to do over the summer, and they mail the jeans to each other, and you get the story of where the jeans are in each. You get that part of the story as the jeans go around between the four. If I ever get out of here, now this one actually takes place in 1975, so I'm using the 50-year rule here to include it in our realistic contemporary fiction, because it's actually, I wanted to include it because it is one that got really good reviews from Native Americans reviewing it, and it's about, it's a YA, and it's about a boy, Lewis Blake, who attends a school. He lives on the reservation near a base. I think it's an Air Force base. And so he attends the same school as the Air Force kids, and as I think the town kids also go there. So both the Air Force kids and the reservation kids are kind of outsiders, and these two become friends. And kind of the cool thing is each of the titles of the chapters is either a song from a Beatles album, Paul McCartney album, and I think there's two, one by Deep Purple and one by Queen or something, so it's kind of cool. He's got them all listed in the back, which album they came from, and whether it's who it's by. Problem novels, or as this says, Roblem novels, the P is probably cut off because I can see it, but you're not going to be able to see it, are novels where the problem is the focus of the novel. There's always a conflict in a novel, but here there's a real issue around which the novel is structured. And Laurie Halse Anderson Speak, which is definitely a YA novel, is about a Melinda who's assaulted at a party in the summer and refuses to speak until she's able to come to terms with what happened. And it's as she goes through the school year and doesn't want to talk to any, like literally does not speak at all. This is actually being made into a graphic novel, which will be interesting to see what kind of reviews it gets as a graphic novel, but it's a very powerful, powerful, powerful novel. Love Joan Bauer. She's also YA. This one, Hope Was Here. She always has really strong female characters who grapple with life in a very optimistic way. Even though there's problems, there's a lot of optimism and, I don't know, love and surrounding them. So in this one, Hope and her aunt move to a small town to take over the local diner. This is a Newbery Honor book. So, I mean, Newbery Honor means it's up to age 14. I always think of her books as a little bit older, but they're so kind of wholesome that you could have different grades read them. Another one in the fall that's kind of fun that she wrote was Squashed, in which 16-year-old Ellie Morgan wants her pumpkin to gain weight while she wants to shed weight. She's growing a pumpkin for a pumpkin contest. Again, they're just like strong characters, female characters that, but just a lot of love around the characters. Then some other novels, just to mention, Seed Folks. I really like this. It's a wonderful tale told from the perspective, I think, 15 or 16 different people who, it's in the city and there's an empty lot and it becomes a community garden. And as it becomes a community garden, you see how each person gets involved in it and how it grows and brings them together. This is a really thin novel, but very some gritty issues in it, so it's good for YAs who might be intimidated by a longer book, because the issues are, I mean, you wouldn't give, if you looked at the width of the book, you would say, let's give this to somebody young, but it's not. Tangerine is a kind of problem novel, mystery, sports, family relationship, includes sinkholes and thunderstorms in Florida, and really good book. Paul Fisher moves to the new town of Tangerine with his family, his older, rather thuggish brother who plays football, while Paul, in spite of vision problems, is doing really well at soccer, particularly I think as a goalie. So interesting book. I listened to this on audio. It was really, really interesting and evocative. Hatchet is an example of Gary Paulson, who does action adventure, survival kind of stories. 13 Reasons Why is an interesting book. A teen commits, a girl commits suicide and leaves behind a recording of that she wants distributed to 13 people. Each person is told to listen and then pass it on to the next person, and how she says how they each contributed to her decision to commit suicide. And it didn't get as much pushback when it was a novel that I remember, but it's relatively recently been made into a movie, and there was a lot of concerns on this around whether it would encourage students to commit suicide, or whether it would, there would be a rash of suicides after they saw this, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I wanted to mention George. This is for grades 4 to 6. It's a really just a beautiful book. George knows she's a girl, and her family and people around her, except for one of her friends, Kelly, who's a girl, is the only other one that knows what George herself knows, is that she's a girl, even though she looks and was born a boy, and she calls herself Melissa. And throughout the whole thing, George uses she and her as the pronouns to describe herself, which I thought was so interesting and really gets you into the headspace of the character. And it's just a really warm and beautiful book. And at one point, Melissa wants to try out for Charlotte in the school play, and the teacher's shocked. But this is the part that Melissa knows that she wants to play. So it's just a fascinating book. But the idea of 13 Reasons Why and George and Hatchet as a survival kind of adventure brings us to the discussion about how real should realistic fiction be. And we're going to read this week about it, but how much graphic detail should be in a book. Are teen novels too dark? There's a lot of complaints that teen novels are too dark, but teens really want to explore these situations through the safety of a book, it seems. And so there's a lot of really kind of dark teen novels that we as adults don't seem to feel comfortable with. Some adults find these books to be prescriptive and feel like kids are going, as with the suicide book, that rather than exploring the issues through reading, they're going to actually follow what the book is doing. They're going to try the risky behaviors that are indicated in the book rather than just read through them and perhaps experience them and explore the consequences through a novel. So it's there's two sides to look at this, and we're going I've given you some readings to kind of look at explore it a little bit more, but it can be a way to work through a problem, although adults tend to want to censor that and not let kids, like I said, they see it as prescriptive, when I think a lot of teens see it as a way to explore. If you think back to what we said at the beginning, that this is a way to explore, walk in somebody else's shoes and become empathetic, even if the students are not exploring it because it's something they're thinking about. It might help them understand situations other students that they know or other people that they know might be in. So we'll talk, I've given you readings about that this week. So what I did is just introduce this week some of the wide variety of realistic novels that are out there. No means exhaustive list of types, but just a framework to talk about them and terms for helping readers find a book that interests them. And a lot of what I want to do in thinking about these is, asking somebody whether they want to read about something real that could happen or not is a way of narrowing down and getting them to a book. Then you can ask them what they want. Do you want sports? Do they want to read about, animals? Do they? So these are also ways to think about how to narrow down and help you suggest to teens or advertise your book to not teens, to readers and students. So the last thing I just want to cover in one slide. Your final project will include literacy strategies. This is not going to be a new concept, I don't think, to those of you in the reading program, unless you're just starting out in the reading program. Probably newer to some of you in the school library program, because we don't focus on it in every class, but you're going to be asked to explore a reading strategy and how you would collaborate, how a teacher and a librarian would collaborate. So you're going to be able to approach it from whether you're a librarian or whether you're a teacher, reading teacher or other kind of teacher, and how, depending on what program you're in, if you're in the library program, you'll want to approach it from how you as a librarian could collaborate with a classroom teacher to support literacy instruction and reading comprehension. So I just wanted to introduce quickly a couple of types of literacy strategies, and then I've given you some more reading to do about it, and we'll also add readings throughout the semester. So think alouds is just one type of strategy when you're modeling or having students think aloud about how to solve a problem or think aloud about what they've read. So that's one kind of literacy strategy. Graphic organizers are another thing you can use to help when you're, particularly with reading comprehension. There's different ways to, important words, about nonfiction writing, character maps, concept wheels, all of these kinds of things. Event maps, when you're thinking about what, comprehension, writing down what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, can help students think back and understand what was going on in the book. KWL chart, this is a classic chart. A good pre-reading strategy, can be used with all ages, tends to be used with younger, but K is activating background knowledge about a topic. What do I already know? W is what they would like to learn about a topic, and L is what they learned from reading. So it can take, you always need to, in order to understand something, you need to anchor it in something that you already know. So if you know, you need to take the familiar in order to explore the unknown. And so if you can get students to think about what's familiar about something already, then it gives them just kind of an anchor and a place to start as they learn, as they read. And then the structure of information. It's important that students understand, particularly with nonfiction books, that students understand the structure of a book and where to find information in a book, the purpose of like sidebars and what kind of information would be them, how to read charts, how to read maps. And this happens a lot in content areas where certain structures of texts are more used in certain content areas. Think about geography with the maps and knowing how to read a legend, knowing how to look into an index in order to find information in a book. These can all help reading and reading comprehension if they understand what they're looking at and how to approach the words in the book by understanding the structure of the information. And that's really brief, but I'm going to give you more reading to do about that, and we'll cover some more as we go along. And so that is it. Thank you very much, and I will see you on the discussion board.